Hello. Okay. Um, I tried once already and it didn't work very well. So I'm going to try again. This time I've set up a browser inside my Obsidian. So that's interesting. Damn, you have no idea what I'm trying to do. Okay. So, what I forgot to mention, because I mentioned it in take one and then I had some technical difficulties, is I listen to Terence McKenna lectures. It's a lot of fun, and he is just one of those people who just goes through so many different topics, and he's not always correct about it, but he is always interesting. And what I think he's also very good at is because he goes through so many different topics and mentions so many different people, it's a great jumping off point for me to start digging deeper into whatever else that I'm interested in. So today I've taken an interest in this one lecture called "The State of the Stone," one of his more hopeful presentations about love and the state of humanity at the end of the millennium. This is from 1995. 1995. And yeah, I think I do this anyway. And I figured I might as well record myself, stream myself doing this. So the idea would be to click play and to start listening. And if there are any clarifications, any comments that I have, I think I can pause and make them. And I usually do pause quite often because I don't know, I have some things that I think are interesting and I just put them here, and it's just good note-taking practice. Yeah. So that's how it's going to work. Okay. So this is Terence McKenna, 1995, State of the Stone.
I sort of think of these get-togethers, they happen periodically, cyclically, but unscheduled, as State of the Stone addresses, or an opportunity for the community to come together and everybody see who's here once again, who has survived, who's gotten out, so forth and so on. I'm very bullish about the situation. Fortunately, I hold the theory that things have to get a lot worse before they can get better. So whenever I see things getting worse, I assume that's the first step toward progress. I think that in the time we've been getting together and talking about these things, the general tone has changed dramatically. When I started talking about all of this, my audience was entirely my peers, old freaks. And many of you were 10 years old. And now the message has been out there for about 12 years that psychedelics actually represent an opportunity for healing, an opportunity to return to religion as it was practiced before the invention of the marketplace. And I'm very pleased as I go around meeting people and discussing this issue to see how much of the youth culture has become sensitive to the psychedelic issue, because it really means that after 20, 30 years of unstinting distortion and misrepresentation by the media and some of the powers that be, that nevertheless the curiosity is intact, the opportunity is available, and people have not been fooled by the effort to denigrate, dumb down, sideline, water down, sell out, whitewash, and screw over the idea that psychedelic plants are an excellent and necessary part of any program of spiritual self-exploration. I'm not going to talk that much about this today because I think it would be preaching to the
That's very
converted.
annoying. Okay. This last thing, I think primarily Terence McKenna should be considered a poet. You can call him a lot of things. You can call him an ethnobotanist, a researcher, a philosopher. They're all kind of true. But what's definitely true is he is a poet. I don't read a lot of poetry, so I'm not the greatest authority on deciding who's a poet and who's not a poet. But I think the bringing together of ideas, and his ability to paint these pictures with his words, unmatched. Well, yeah, I think he's very good at it, basically. And sentences like this, he does this quite often. He'll just start listing off a whole bunch of verbs or nouns, and then eventually he'll get to the point. He kind of just feels his way through the whole thing. It's fun. I guess the context that you would need here is this is from 1995, and if you, let's see here, how does this work? Unknown, right? So there's a few, but maybe this is the oldest one that we have, 1982, and so now he's talking in 1995. And yeah, that's, he says 12 years. And so it's been about 12 years. And I think at the beginning, he focused a lot on the biochemistry of it, the substances themselves. But over time, he started talking about some of his more metaphysical positions. And those are just as funky, if not funkier. So, he says he's not going to talk too much today about psychedelics, but we'll see.
I'm not even going to remind you that our evolutionary heritage lies in the use of psychedelics, that it was in all probability psychedelics that called forth our humanness. I've talked about this in numerous forums. It doesn't have to be particularly gone over today.
One of the ways, well, he's talked about this in many lectures, but of course, the book where he makes this claim is The Food of the Gods, which is, I have it somewhere. An interesting book. He's not the best writer, I think. It's definitely more fun listening to him, but it's an interesting book. And his whole thing is the stoned ape theory. He was one of the people who was a big proponent of that. So you should look that up. It's fun.
Since this is a hometown crowd. Since this is peer review, I would rather go to some of the stuff that plays more with more resistance in Des Moines and Cleveland, and beta test it here. While there's still time to recant. San Francisco is an incredibly forgiving town. If you need to go somewhere and make a mistake, this is probably the place. Anyway, after I've been altering my consciousness pharmacologically since I was 18, then trying to fold it back into the database of the culture to make sense of it mathematically, religiously, philosophically, historically, artistically, so forth and so on. And my conclusions become more and more radical. Last night in Sacramento, I lectured the psilocybin's impact on human evolution, and they quoted some anthropologist somewhere who wouldn't even give his name for the attribution of his no comment, saying it was too radical to even be considered. And I thought to myself, and the problem is, it's the most respectable idea I've got.
It's funny.
So, having given that its run for its money last night, what I'll talk to you about today, and then later we can have a question period, and it can be free-ranging, and whatever your concerns can come to the fore. But it occurs to me that science has very radically failed. And it's an unusual point to make because we live in the impression that science is somehow at the pinnacle of its explanatory powers and that it is going to give us clean air, better societies, safer sex, better entertainment, and ultimately some kind of explanation about how the universe really works. And in the past year, like happy kittens, they have dragged in and dropped on our doorstep the top quark, which is something to find out there in the bulrushes. If you did.
Okay. I mean, you see what I mean about poetry? In the past year, like happy kittens, they have dragged in and dropped on our doorstep the top quark. I've got to see when that was discovered. The truth quark, the most massive of all observed elementary particles. 1995. Yes, indeed. Fermilab.
Didn't know to look for it, you probably would never find it. But nevertheless, for all of its capacity to razzle-dazzle, science has some serious drawbacks, some serious limitations that psychedelic experiences make more starkly evident, I think, simply because psychedelic people then compare the full spectrum of their experience to the paradigm they're being offered. For example, science proceeds probabilistically. This is how it's been doing its work for about 3 centuries. This involves an assumption that it has never been proven and is very, very difficult to test. It's the assumption that time is invariant. You see, probability theory rests on the idea of experiment. Science proceeds by experiment. But built into the concept of experiment is this very fishy notion called the restoration of initial conditions. And it turns out that there ain't no such creature. You can never restore initial conditions. A way of putting it is you can never go home again. You know, Heraclitus said we never step into the same river twice. If you're paying attention, you might notice that that means we never step into the same river once. Right?
I'm hoping that he explains himself a little bit more here. I think I've heard him do that in some other lectures. So his problem with probability is that if you say that if you throw a die and it has 6 sides, then you can say that the probability of any one of those numbers showing up is 1 in 6, but it does not give you predictive powers. So you cannot still say, if you roll the die, what's going to come up. And how science, the institution of science, justifies this is by citing probability, that it's the best that we have right now. Let's see if he explains himself a little bit more.
See, science is a historical process that began with the Greeks and naturally dealt with the simpler questions first. And the simpler questions are, what is the world made of? How does it work? The complex questions are things like, what is language and how do we know truth? The Greeks sort of bridged that one. But they had this idea that because God was perfect, the universe should behave according to models of mathematical perfection. And so the planets were assumed to go in perfect circles, and the classical objects of Aristotelian geometry were made the basis of science. Now, one by one, over time, these perfect mathematical objects have had to be dumped and gotten rid of because they came into contradiction with observation. The difference between Ptolemaic astronomy and Copernican astronomy is that Ptolemaic astronomy does all its calculations with perfect circles within perfect circles. And what Copernicus said was, wouldn't it be simpler to use ellipses? And then you only have to use one ellipse rather than circles within circles within circles. But the leap of faith, or the leap of understanding that you have to make there, is the understanding that nature doesn't, the planets don't move in perfect circles. They're not gods. They're balls of rock obeying the laws of gravitation, keeping them in orbit. So one by one, these perfect objects of Greek mathematical explanation were abandoned. The sole exception is the idea that time is a perfectly smooth surface. This idea is very necessary.
So, he does not explain himself a lot more with probability, but this is an important one. Time being a perfectly smooth surface. Well, actually, I think that this is linked, and he's going to get to this. Yeah, let's see.
To science, because it means that measurements of physical systems are not time-dependent. In other words, it would be counterintuitive to a scientist to be told, you will get a different charge for the electron if you measure it on Tuesdays and Thursdays than Mondays and Saturdays. They would say that's preposterous. The charge of the electron must be invariant in time. Why? It's simply a first pass with the razor of simplicity. I mean, explanation should be as simple as possible, but no simpler, or you miss the point. So when we look...
It's an interesting claim, right? Why is it preposterous that the charge of the electron could be different on Tuesdays and Thursdays when compared to Mondays and Saturdays? I don't think... I mean, this is where my my study of metaphysics is basically non-existent. But this is what's interesting about Terence McKenna, right? He will take you to a place where you will feel two things. One, you will feel this distinct emotion of, that's a ridiculous thing that you've just said. That doesn't make any sense. And the second, the ridiculous thing that you just heard, you will not be able to explain why exactly it is ridiculous. Maybe you can. Maybe you can explain why it's ridiculous, but I cannot. And therefore, I listen to Terence McKenna. Right, let's go back a little bit. Is that not allowed? Oh, it's part of the browser. No. Come on. Come on.
The sole exception is the idea that time is a perfectly smooth surface. This idea is very necessary to science because it means that measurements of physical systems are not time dependent. In other words, it would be counterintuitive to a scientist to be told you will get a different charge for the electron if you measure it on Tuesdays and Thursdays than Mondays and Saturdays. They would say that's preposterous. The charge of the electron must be invariant in time. Why? It's simply a first pass with the razor of simplicity. I mean, explanation should be as simple as possible, but no simpler, or you miss the point. So when we look at complex phenomenon like the fall of empires, love affairs, corporate takeovers, social revolutions, these things never happen the same way twice. That's why we invented what we call the social sciences, meaning no science at all, but full of good intention. These kinds of complex phenomena are very critically dependent on initial conditions. You know, a love affair, between whom and whom, where, under what economic conditions, what were the religious preferences of the parties, and what did their parents think, and what did their children think. In other words, initial conditions set the course, and yet initial conditions are never the same in these complex systems. Science works very differently from ordinary perception. As you can see if you walked around on the floor of this gathering, anomaly is highly prized here. If we have 1,000 people who go out on a starry night and see only the ordinary constellations, that is buried. But if one person goes out on a starry night and sees a rectangular black object a city block long with softly glowing yellow lights moving along the horizon, that's big news. Science.
Wait. Anomaly is highly prized here. I wonder why he says this. Where is this from? I think quite often Terence McKenna would get invited to speak at many of these new age alternative science conventions, like UFO conventions and stuff. And yeah, so I've definitely heard him say things like this, which are kind of slight jabs at the event that he is presenting his work in, but he kind of subtly distances himself from it. I think that's one of the things that's going on here. Oh no, come on. Is there really no way to... Okay, fine.
Science works exactly the opposite. If you want, for example, to carry out a scientific... Science works exactly the opposite. If you want, for example, to carry out a scientific observation, and you measure, let's say, the electrical charge running through a wire, and you measure it 1,000 times, and 999 times it's between 3 and 4 volts, but one time you get a measurement of 1,290 volts, a good scientist discards the aberrant measurement. Just says, well, that can't be right. That's ridiculous. Get that puppy out of there. Now average the other 999. Completely different way of doing intellectual business than the way it is done at the edge of human thought, where we seek the curious, the anomalous, the unusual, and then that leads us to wild generalizations backward against the pattern of normality.
I'm sure there's like scientists and philosophers of science who have a lot of things to say about this. I'm sure that he's satirizing some of this. This is very cartoonish. I don't think that's how it works. If you got 1290 volts instead of 3 or 4 volts, then I'm sure you'd look into it. But the point is, though, that if you can't explain, you check your instrumentation. If you can't explain it, what would you do? I feel like it would be too anomalous. But yeah, maybe this is not the case, and maybe he's completely wrong about this. So it's just like watching stand-up.
Normal happenstance. Okay, so this enslavement to Greek idealism of this particular sort has caused science to be fairly helpless in describing the kinds of complex systems that now more and more dominate our lives. Global economies, the internet, interlocking markets, so forth and so on. I want to suggest, it's a two-part suggestion, and this is the first part, that there is going to have to be a general revision of how science does its business if we want to actually extend the explanatory power of science into the domain of human social and intellectual complexity. And what science is going to have to do is recognize that, like everything else ever examined through the lens of science, time is going to have to be seen as some kind of variable phenomenon, something that is not a perfect mathematical plane, but has a topological texture at some level. It may appear smooth from a certain distance, but as your point of view sinks into it, this perfect smoothness is revealed to be, in fact, a composite of irregularities, that it is made of fractal subsets of itself. Now, science has led.
Juicy. Yeah, I mean, the planet, the Earth, is not a perfect sphere. And anything that looks perfectly smooth to us is not perfectly smooth and has irregularities. And as our instrumentation gets better, as our understanding and technology gets better, we can see the irregularities, right? So it's not an invalid point. Science has not extended it through time. Okay, interesting.
The big news coming out of science in the last 10 years, perhaps the last certain truth that science will secure before its transformation, and it's a very important one, it's that nature is self-similar across scale. This is something that couldn't have been said even 10 years ago. Nature is self-similar across scale.
Okay. This is one that I don't have a tattoo, and I've never even considered getting a tattoo. I guess mainly because what would I put there? What do I think I believe in enough that I think it's fine to put on my body permanently, semi-permanently. But yeah, this is pretty interesting. I love this concept.
This is big news, big understanding. And what does it mean? Well, it means, I'm sure you all have pondered the similarity between the structure of an atom, a galaxy, and a solar system. And if you inquired about this, you were told it's coincidence. Well, P.W. Bridgman is the person who pointed out that a coincidence is what you have left over when you apply a bad theory. You see? So, until 10 years ago, when you asked this question, you would be told it's a coincidence. It's easy to make a scientific revolution. I can remember when I was about 9, going to my mother in a state of high excitement and saying, have you noticed that South America will fit against Africa like a puzzle piece? And then we looked into it and we were told, this is a coincidence. Well, it wasn't 10 years before continental drift made a revolution out of the earth sciences by doing what? By recognizing what an 8-year-old child could point out, that Africa and South America were obviously once joined together. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to see this. You just have to have some experience with crossword puzzles and an open mind. So nature is self-similar across scales. That means that an atom is like a galaxy, is like a solar system, but it means more than that. It means that we can extrapolate toward cosmic processes by thinking about our own lives.
This thing though, I mean, yeah. So far, all of the things that he's talked about, maybe it sounds ridiculous, maybe it sounds reasonable. I don't know. I don't know how this sounds to you, but nature being self-similar across scale is a very interesting concept, and I've heard it from several scientists. The one that I'm most excited by right now is Michael Levin. And Michael Levin has a wonderful YouTube video about, what does he call it? And then what else YouTube? I feel like, yes, nothing in biology makes sense without teleology is a wonderful. And he makes the same point. And he...
If you want to download any of the primary papers,
I'm not going to play that now, but yeah, why shouldn't I actually? There's this point that he makes about all of these fields and all of these structures, they are stuff similar. And he calls them a homology, not an analogy. Yes, they're not analogous. They're homologous, which is a word that I didn't know existed. That is fun. That's fun to know. Yeah, let's see if he talks about it here.
first thing. So we this is basically a multi-scale competency architecture where all through the scales from the molecules up to the collectives and groups, all of these things are, as it turns out, solving problems in diverse spaces. Now with different degrees of sophistication. Now, what are these spaces? Well, we as humans, because of our own evolutionary history, we're obsessed with three-dimensional space. We're primed to notice intelligent behavior, goal-seeking behaviors. Things I've shown you basic homeostasis. I've shown you more flexible kind. Notice the parallel of this in cognition. When I'm in regulatory networks, if you want to make changes, the system is not going towards anything. I'm try to make competencies occur and the final thing in its incredible order. Everything is in the right place, the right size, next to the right thing. Amazing that allow the voltage. And what we decided to do was pivoting, regionalize that face. Different means. So
I should have just kept playing. Oh my god. Okay, we'll play that
now
again.
Now with different degrees of sophistication. Now, what are these spaces? Well, we as humans, because of our own evolutionary history, we're obsessed with three-dimensional space. We're primed to notice intelligent behavior, goal-seeking behaviors of medium-sized objects moving at medium speeds, so birds and mammals and things like that. But biology has been solving problems in other spaces for a really long time. So there's the space of gene expression, so high-dimensional transcriptional space, space of physiological states, and anatomical morphospace, which is basically the morphospace of all possible configurations or shapes of a body. This is the one we're going to talk the most about today. But my claim is that just as obvious animals navigate three-dimensional space to meet their goals, we have all kinds of structures in our body that are navigating with similar kinds of skills, navigating these other spaces that are very hard for us to notice, and until we have the right theory and the right instrumentation, which is what I think we're doing, just like with that with the idea of the electromagnetic spectrum. We're developing tools to port everything that works here, so behavioral and cognitive science, to we are porting it to these other substrates, and that helps us visualize these things. So I claim that teleology is a subset of the spectrum of intelligence, and what I mean by intelligence is this. William James gave a nice, very cybernetic definition of intelligence. He didn't talk.
I'm realizing I should probably give a little more context. Michael Levin works on something that he calls collective intelligences, and the thing that he's pointing out is something that he calls mind blindness. As human beings, he says that we are not very good at seeing evidence of mind or intelligence in things that don't look human. And his idea of, and in this, he just means medium-sized objects moving at medium speeds in three-dimensional space. So we think that intelligence is something that can only happen in this space, but his point is that intelligence can happen and collective intelligences can occur in all sorts of different spaces. And why I'm bringing this up, when we're talking about this whole thing that nature is being self-similar across scales, is because he kind of makes the same point.
About brains, he didn't talk about what problem space was involved. He said it's the ability to reach the same goal by different means. So this ability to reach the same goal, that's basically teleology, that there is a goal and that the system is going to exert effort to try to get there. But the different means is interesting. It means that every system is going to have some degree of the ability to get there when circumstances change, when you put barriers in its place and so on. And that's a really important part of the toolkit here. If you want to study teleology, you cannot do it from pure observation. You have to put barriers between the system and whatever you think its goal is, and observe the degree to which it can be clever by getting around whatever you just did to it. So our hypothesis is this: for the.
Did you hear that? So that's one of the things that I'm noticing that I actually have this somewhere. Yeah, good. I think this is from, yes. If you want to study teleology, you cannot do it from pure observation. You have to put barriers between the system and whatever you think its goal is, and observe the degree to which it can be clever by getting around whatever you just did to it. I'm sure if he were writing this, he'd probably be more succinct about it, but if you think that a system might be teleological, then you're going to have to do things to it. You're going to have to poke it, prod it, and then see how it reacts. And just coming back to the concept of psychedelics, this is what a psychedelic does to our brains. It shakes it from its normal patterns, and then as it comes back to the steady state, you can observe how the brain works, how the mind works, how consciousness works, how your own thought patterns work. And maybe Michael Levin would agree that if you think that you're an intelligence and that your ego is made up of a collective intelligence of thoughts and identities and all of that, then maybe the way to study it would be to shake it, put some barriers, and see what happens. Anyway.
For this portion, I'm going to show you morphogenesis is a collective intelligence. We are all collective intelligences because we are made of parts. So this is all intelligence is collective intelligence, I think. And what it does is it exerts its behavioral competencies in anatomical space, in getting from being a single cell to whatever we end up being. It navigates that space, and I'm going to show you some really cool ways that it does that. So we're gonna study this. In moving here from neuroscience, you have to go to a different time scale, so minutes instead of milliseconds, different problem space, morphospace instead of three-dimensional motion, but everything else is the same. The mechanisms are homologous. Many of the same algorithms, perceptual bistability, active inference, you name it, all of this stuff works really well. And in fact, I used to have my students do this by hand, and now we made a tool for people to do this. If you take any neuroscience paper and you do a find replace, and every time it says neuron, you just say cell. And every time it says millisecond, you say minutes or hours. You got yourself a developmental biology paper. And it works amazingly well because there is this deep underlying symmetry between the two. So I'm going to show you here 6.
Right. We'll come back to this lecture at some point. I mean, I think it's an extremely interesting lecture, and it's got 33,000 views. And he's putting up stuff every other day or something. My God. But he's also bringing in other scientists to talk. So yeah. Check this guy out. Michael Levin. Back to Terence.
So nature is self-similar across scales. That means that an atom is like a galaxy, is like a solar system, but it means more than that. It means that we can extrapolate toward cosmic processes by thinking about our own lives. Because our own lives are a tiny fractal piece of data that is part of a much larger, integrated, modular hierarchy that we now realize will have the same architectonic as our own immediate experience, except it will be expressed on a much larger scale. So that's the first and simplest part of this suggestion for a reformation of science that I want to propose. First of all, that this fractal principle be more clearly enunciated and understood. Everybody is talking about fractals, but it took Ralph Abraham to get it down to a bumper sticker for me. And it is. Nature is self-similar across scales. Companies explode the same way economies explode, the same way the biota of a continent explode. Processes are always similar, but only differ in scale. And what that means then is that our most immediate datum of experience, which is the feeling of being in a body, alive and feeling, can be extrapolated and mapped on to larger and smaller processes in the universe to give not only a sentient universe, a living universe, a dynamic universe, a universe with purpose, but it also gives us a universe with a very interesting set of closure properties that are different from the ones we learned from science. The thing about science and its cosmology is that it makes us irrelevant. We're told that we are an accident around an ordinary star, in an ordinary galaxy, in an ordinary portion of the local supercluster, and it's just ordinary, 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 nothing to be excited about. And then, you have existentialism, which says, well, then if you want to get excited, you have to admit that you're just doing it on your own hook, This is called conferring meaning rather than discovering meaning. We confer meaning, the existentialists tell us, and it's good as long as it lasts, and then that's nothing too. But all of these conclusions have been based on ignoring a second fact about nature that is as cogent as its fractality, and far more important for us, I believe. And this second factor is that the further back in time you go, the slower everything unfolds. Our present domain of experience is a domain of furious activity. I mean, many things go on this planet in a single day. There are inventions, there are books, there are transactions, there are meetings and dissolutions. We live in a busy world. As you journey backward in time, the world becomes less and less busy. And when you leave the domain of organic evolution, the world becomes boring as hell. And when you go further back to the period before even molecular chemistry, you know, it's so boring one can barely compose a comment. So infused with ennui is the observer in the contemplation of the scene. But science has never inculcated this observation into its model of reality. We're told time is invariant. Therefore, this notion of speeding up or of complexity in some parts of time and not in others, it must be an artifact of observation. It must be an illusion or a mistake. It isn't real. But I maintain it is one of the most persistent facts about reality. And I've spoken of it here in terms of things get simpler as you go backward in time. We could stand that on its head and point out that things get more complex as you move forward in time. And that means that this moment is the most complex moment the universe has ever known, at least the local universe.
So this is his second point. The first claim, nature is self-similar across scale. Fractality. And the second claim that he's making is that the further back in time you go, the slower everything unfolds. This is a point that he makes quite in quite a few lectures. We don't have to wait till 1995 for him to make this point, but his whole thing is that everything is speeding up. Everything is speeding up, and that it's hard to describe exactly what is speeding up, but he's calling it complexity in this section, and it's also he also uses the term novelty, and I've heard him refer to this also as novelty theory. So
this moment is the most complex moment the universe has ever known, at least the local universe. That means, in a way, if the universe started at the Big Bang, it ends right here, right now, what I call local now, because the rest of time has not yet undergone the formality of occurring. So here we are, the inheritors of the Big Bang, standing in the ultra-complex local now. Now, what do I mean by complex? Well, on the platform of cellular evolution arose higher animals, complex ecosystems. On the platform of that arose early human culture. Upon that platform rose late human culture, including ourselves, including technology. My point here that I want to try to sell you on is that nature is a novelty conserving engine of some sort, that far from being a random process driven toward entropy by the second law of thermodynamics, nature is a process of complexification, that whenever this process is dealt a blow, it immediately sets out to recover and surpass whatever previous level of complexification it had attained.
I'm reading Pilgrim at Tinker Creek by Annie Dillard. A wonderful book. Wonderful book. Definitely strays into the philosophy of science area, and there's a term that that Annie Dillard uses. Maybe I can find this in my reader app, and then we can follow along. I usually have these books physically. I like reading them physically, but I also have it digitally because, sometimes it's just easier to copy paste things. I think this might be one of the first times that she uses this term, intricacy. Well, the chapter is called Intricacy, so there's this wonderful section before this, but I'm not going to read that. I am going to read you where is it? What? Okay. Intricacy means that there is a fluted fringe to the something that exists over against nothing, a fringe that rises and spreads, burgeoning in detail. So then she has this whole thought experiment, but let's not get to that here. Yep. Yeah. Evolution, of course, is the vehicle of intricacy. The stability of simple forms is the sturdy base from which more complex, stable forms might arise, forming in turn more complex forms, and so on. The stratified nature of this stability, like a house built on rock, on rock, on rock, performs in Jacob Bronowski's terms as the ratchet that prevents the whole shebang from slipping back. Bring a feather into the house and a piano, put a sculpture on the roof, sure, and fly banners from the lintels, the house will hold. I had heard the term evolutionary ratchet before, but I think I only just understood it. Because a ratchet is a mechanism that allows movement in one way but not in the other. Right? It's like a valve, but for movement. Who's this guy? Jacob Bronowski. Polish British mathematician and philosopher, best known for developing a humanistic approach to science and as the presenter and writer of the 13-part 1973 BBC television documentary series and accompanying book, The Ascent of Man. He was widely regarded as one of the most revered intellectuals on the global stage. Very interesting. Very interesting. Good. Jacob. What? What's his name? Well, she says Bronowski. This is Bronowski. What does the printed version say? Jacob Bronowski. The editor missed that. Nice. It's always fun when you spot things like this, you know? And we will make a... What is that? Animate. Okay. Good. Good, good. Yeah, I mean, I brought that up because the vehicle of intricacy, the stability of simple forms is the sturdy base from which more complex stable forms might arise, forming in turn more complex forms and so on, is almost word for word.
On the platform of cellular evolution arose higher animals, complex ecosystems. On the platform of that arose early human culture. Upon that platform rose late human culture, including ourselves, including technology. My point here that I want to try to sell you on is that nature is a novelty conserving engine of some sort. That far from being a random process driven toward entropy by the second law of thermodynamics, nature is a process of complexification. That whenever this process is dealt a blow, it immediately sets out to recover and surpass whatever previous level of complexification it had attained. Well, no.
It's almost been an hour, I think. Yeah. And I think that's good enough for now. Quick summary. He starts off talking about science, despite its capacity to razzle-dazzle, has some serious drawbacks. And the things that he says science refuses to acknowledge or doesn't fold into its worldview, are two main things. One, nature is self-similar across scale. And if there's a scientist only now still pointing that out in 2025, I think 30 years ago saying this is pretty interesting. And the second is novelty theory. The further back in time you go, the slower everything unfolds. And he ends with, nature is a novelty conserving engine of some sort. And I should also copy this in here. I'm already reading that book and making notes, and so isn't that nice? I'm just going to change it. I don't like doing that often, but it's too much work. Okay, yeah, that was part 1. That was about 27 minutes. So maybe there's going to be another part at least. All right. See you next time, if this happens.